our very fancy comment box over there. If you want to fill out a hard copy survey after this event, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, we have a link on our homepage. You can go right to lassings.wis.edu and click on the survey, and there's a little drop down. You can pick today's lecture, and it's not evaluating our speaker per se. So don't feel it's more about just the programming that we are putting together to find out if it's meeting the needs of our attendees. So one other quick thing I wanted to mention is that we have a sort of a last minute event that we wanted to notify all of you on that we are co-sponsoring, and it missed the noticias because there were issues, visa issues with the speaker. His name is Pedro Cayuqueo. He's a Mapuche journalist from Chile, and he is going to be giving a talk this Thursday at noon at USAL. I will leave this up there, and I'm also going to send an email out to our listserv. So if you're on the listserv, you'll get details. But the title is 40 Years After the Coup, Indigenous Rights, Democracy, and the Struggle for Recognition of the Mapuche People in Chile. So that's all I've got to say. Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for coming to our lecture, our series here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Noam Lupu. For us, it's great to see how the faculty keeps on growing and reinvigorating the program, so it's great to have you here. Noam is a professor here in the Department of Political Science. He got his PhD from Princeton University with an award-winning dissertation. His current book project is on party brands in crisis. So join me to welcome Noam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, especially on such a lovely day. This is part of a larger project co-authored with Nick Carnes at Duke. Most of his research is on the United States, and so I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between this project on Latin America and similar things that we see in the United States. This particular paper and set of evidence that I'll present is fairly far along, so I welcome comments and questions on that, but I'll sort of talk at the end about where we want to go with this project and sort of future papers that we're working on now, and I'd particularly love some feedback on all of that. So the question we want to ask in this project is, does class matter for representation? That's really our big question. And in political science in the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a kind of proliferation of the study of elites. Part of that effort focused on the class backgrounds of those elites. And people noticed that there was inequality in the descriptive representation of social class. As Matthews summarizes in 1985, almost everywhere legislators are better educated, possess higher status occupations, and have more privileged backgrounds than the people they represent. This is true basically in every democracy that people have looked at. It's certainly true in the United States, and as I'll show you, it's certainly true in Latin America. But by the mid-1970s, a conventional wisdom, at least in the literature, the research in political science, emerged that this inequality in class representation doesn't matter. And so Putnam, sort of summarizing all of this in 1976, wrote, "The assumption of a correlation between attitude and social origin lies behind most of these studies of social backgrounds of elites, but most of the available evidence tends to disconfirm that assumption." Basically, since the mid-1970s, this has been sort of the conventional wisdom. People have not looked at the effects of the class backgrounds of the people who represent our representatives because it was thought that that doesn't actually matter. What matters are all sorts of other things, including party and constituencies, public opinion, those kinds of things that political science has focused on. Now, we want to argue that that conventional wisdom is based on a set of flaws or shortcomings. The first is in the measurement of social class. The way that these studies in the 60s and the 70s measured class mostly focused on education, although there's some variety here. But since then, most of the study of social class within political science and sociology has sort of converged around the idea that occupation is a much better measure of social class. The types of attitudes that these studies focused on is also, we think, problematic. They mostly looked at things like efficacy and the representational style of these elected elites. But class-based political divisions manifest themselves in economic attitudes. So when we look at public opinion, and I'll show you some evidence of this for Latin America, the class-based divisions are typically around economic issues and specifically around the role of the state in the economy. And this is parallel to the work on other kinds of personal characteristics like gender and ethnicity, which tend to manifest themselves on issues related to gender and ethnicity, respectively, right? So if we want to look for class-based political divisions, we should be focusing on economic attitudes, not necessarily on these other kinds of outcomes that the literature had focused on in the 60s and 70s. And finally, we think that we have to focus on the discretion of representatives in their behavior. So most of the studies in the 60s and the 70s focused on roll call voting, essentially sort of how legislators voted when a bill was brought to a vote. But legislators actually often have very little discretion over voting. Often that's the point when parties really sort of whip elites behind the sort of party position. In fact, legislators have much more discretion in sort of the pre-voting stages of policy making, and a lot of legislative studies have sort of turned their attention to agenda setting, introducing bills, bringing bills and issues to the agenda, the policy-making agenda, rather than conditional on a bill being brought to the agenda, how they vote one way or the other. So we think that we have to take discretion into account when we study this question. We also think that there's good reason to think that class should matter. Mass political attitudes certainly divide by class. This is true around the world, and particularly, again, regarding economic issues. Legislative attitudes and conduct divide by class in the United States, and so this is my co-author's book that's coming out this month, shows that class does matter for legislators in the United States, even though the proportion of legislators in the House of, in Congress in the United States has never been higher than 10%. And other personal characteristics like gender and ethnicity, and this is sort of has been a booming literature for a couple of decades now, seem to influence legislative behavior. So we think all of this suggests good reason to believe that class should matter. So we have a kind of basic theory of why class would matter, or when class matters for elite decision-making or elite behavior. Legislators from different classes have different attitudes like everyone else in the population, particularly regarding the role of the state in the economy. When those legislators are constrained, those attitudes don't have an effect on behavior. But when they have discretion, they use their own personal attitudes to inform their behavior. Right? So this is sort of the distinction between when they do and don't have discretion. So what are the empirical implications? The analysis should focus on economic attitudes, so that's what we're going to try to do. The analysis of roll call voting is unlikely to yield class differences. Instead, our analysis should focus on agenda-setting behaviors, and so here we're going to look at where legislators have discretion. Here we're going to look at the actual introduction of bills. Why study Latin America? Obviously, in this crowd maybe is not so important to say, but it's worth saying that Latin America is a good place to study this. The importance of class in politics sort of varies across the region. So we have some variation there. There's actually cross-national data on legislators' class backgrounds, their attitudes, and the choices that they make. In particular, the University of Salamanca in Spain has been conducting now for almost 2 decades anonymous representative surveys of legislators in the 18 major democracies in the region. So we have from these surveys data on their class measured through their prior occupation and their attitudes about a host of issues, including the economic issues that we think should matter. And then in the case of Argentina, Argentina collects data on legislators' backgrounds, including their prior occupations, and has readily available data on their choices in office. So here we're going to have class, we're going to know whether or not they have some discretion, and we're actually going to be able to measure their behavior rather than just their attitudes through the surveys. And actually, Argentina, we think, is going to be sort of an ideal case for us because it's a case where parties actually discipline legislators quite strongly relative to the rest of the region. In fact, relative to the world, Argentine parties are highly disciplined when it comes to voting. And so you would expect not to see class mattering in this kind of context, right? So it's sort of an ideal case for us to focus on. Just as sort of background to fix ideas here, this is just from a Latin America, the Americas Barometer survey from 2008. We've sort of measured class using people's occupations. These are just public opinion surveys. And to give you a sense of the class divisions in mass economic attitudes. And here there are questions about the role of the state, what you think the role of the state in the economy should be. And we've just sort of categorized them. And so the bars that are sort of further to the right mean that people from the working class have a more statist or more sort of interventionist view of the role of the state in the economy. The bars that sort of go to the left mean that people in sort of the professional classes want more state intervention in the economy than people in the working class, right? So, and you can see that for the majority of the cases, there is a kind of working class bias towards more state intervention in the economy. There are, of course, cases where class doesn't seem to matter at all, and I actually don't think any of these cases are sort of statistically significant differences. So for the most part, we either have a kind of working class interventionist bias or we don't. And on average, we have that sort of across the region. So class matters for people's attitudes about the role of the state in the economy on average in the region. So now we're going to turn to the surveys from the University of Salamanca and see whether class matters for the attitudes, the expressed attitudes of legislators. So we're going to focus on the sort of second wave of this survey, which now I think is up to the 5th wave. So this focuses on the legislatures in the early 2000s, again across the 18 countries. A representative sample of legislators in each country, and we're going to end up with 1,500 legislators in our sample. There are fairly detailed questions about their prior occupations, and we've grouped them into 7 categories. There are lots of ways to sort of classify these things. We think this is sort of a one reasonable way to do it. For those of you who are familiar with Erickson and Goldthorpe, this is sort of similar to their schema. But actually in the analysis I'll show you, we'll mostly just focus on comparing the working class to everybody else. We have questions about, a set of questions about their views of the most desirable role of government in 10 different functions, so including price controls, education, unemployment insurance. And so we're going to sort of collapse these into one index of their attitudes about the role of government in these socioeconomic interventions. There's another set of questions about the most desirable level of government spending on 7 social programs, including infrastructure programs, housing, pensions, and so we'll sort of collapse those into another index on spending rather than, perhaps sort of more normative questions. Then we'll turn to actual legislative conduct, not just their attitudes. And so here we're going to focus on Argentina. We have the occupations of each legislator from an NGO called Directorio Legislativo, which collects these data from the legislators once they're elected. We're going to use roll call voting ideal points, which others have calculated in a sort of standard way that political science has come to sort of calculate these things for the 2000-2001 legislative session. So Eduardo Alemán and his co-authors have done that. And then we're going to look at sponsorship data for the same period, that coding of which we have done. We identified, or the research assistants that we hired to do this, identified 800 bills that deal with socioeconomic issues. Again, we're going to sort of focus on the socioeconomic issues that are comparable to the ones that the Salamanca surveys asked about. And then those research assistants coded whether the bill asked for an increase, a decrease, or a maintaining of spending and regulation. Right? And so we can compute for each legislator the number of bills that they sponsor that either increase or decrease government involvement in that, in sort of economic, in the economic arena. So to give you a sense of, from the Salamanca survey data, the sort of descriptive inequalities in terms of class representation, the first bar here are legislators whose prior occupations are sort of working class occupations. As you can see, it's often in the single digits, sort of never more than 25% of the legislature is made up of people who come from a working class social background. The rest of these are, so these are the other categories that we look at: business people, private sector, the military, lawyers, career politicians, and service-based white-collar professionals. So what you can see is, so overall, it's about, I think, 12% of Latin American legislators are come from a working class background. This is data from the ILO collected from national censuses from most of the countries that we don't have. 4 of these countries we don't have data on. And again, this bar is the, this is now in the population, represents the proportion of the population that is working class, that has occupations in the working class. And what you can see is that the working class population is typically between 60 and 80% of the population. Lower in sort of the more developed countries in the regions, higher in some of the poorer countries in the region, more or less as you would expect. But what we want to highlight is that the difference between the proportion of the population that comes from the working class and the proportion of legislators that come from the working class is fairly high, 50 to 60%. Quite a bit higher than it is in the United States, but still a striking gap between the population and its representatives in the national legislature. So now let's look at the attitudes of these legislators, right? And so from the Salamanca surveys, this is the percentage of those 10 state functions that they were asked about that they thought should receive little or no intervention from the government. And so these are the responses of the legislators from the working class. And there you have sort of the others. And what you can see is that they all differ from the legislators from the working class. Legislators from the working class were less likely to say that they wanted no or less intervention of the government in these socioeconomic areas. The same holds for spending on social programs. Again, legislators from the working class were less likely to say that they didn't wanted the same or lower expenditure on these socioeconomic areas than everybody else, particularly service-based professionals, but this sort of holds across the board. So legislators from the working class have different attitudes than other legislators. Right, lawmakers from the working class bring a more, in the sort of American terminology, progressive or what we might call interventionist economic perspective. And this is true even when we take into account a host of other things. So we can do this analysis sort of controlling for race, country, religion, gender, party, which you might think would matter, marital status. We've also done this analysis, at least for a subset of countries, with some controls for characteristics of the constituencies, the rate of unionization. You might think that those things matter. None of that gets rid of the difference between the working class legislators and the rest of the legislators. And now if we turn to conduct, and here sort of focusing on the case of Argentina, again, if we look at the spending attitudes from the survey, this is now just comparing the blue-collar sort of working class folks to white-collar sort of government and private sector. You can see that there's a difference, especially between the working class and the sort of white-collar private sector legislators from white-collar private sector backgrounds. If we look at the voting behavior in Argentina, there's no difference between these. And in fact, the difference is sort of the opposite of what you might think, but it's not significant, statistically significant. But if we look at their introduction of bills, there is actually an effect. Legislators in Argentina from working class backgrounds introduce more interventionist economic bills than their counterparts who come from white-collar backgrounds. And actually, and so we've sort of estimated the effect of this in the 2000-2001 session. If the Argentine Congress had looked like the population in terms of social class, we would have had 50 more progressive or interventionist bills than we actually did. And 50 out of 800 socioeconomic bills, we think that's a pretty important agenda-setting difference. So when legislators are constrained, that is, when they cast their votes, class doesn't matter, or doesn't seem to matter. But when legislators have discretion, when they decide which bills to introduce in this kind of agenda-setting fashion, lawmakers from different classes do actually behave differently. So we think the old notion that class is irrelevant in the world's legislatures appears to be mistaken. The unequal descriptive representation that many scholars have noted in these national legislatures is an important source of substantive representational inequalities. So actually, we have some thoughts on sort of where to go next with this, and we think the big question now is, why do legislatures around the world underrepresent people from the working class? Why are there so few legislators who come from working class backgrounds? And we have some hypotheses, or I think there's sort of at least 3 ways to think about answering this question. One is that maybe voters are less likely to support candidates from the working class. Maybe they think that if you don't have a PhD in political science, you're not qualified to be a legislator. That's probably wrong, but anyhow. So we're working on setting up some survey experiments in a couple of Latin American contexts where we can sort of present people with hypothetical candidates and change their class background and see whether that has an effect on whether people say they want to support them. Another possibility is that working class candidates simply can't raise enough money to run for national elections. There's actually reasonably reliable data on campaign contributions in Brazil, and also lots of data from Brazil. So you actually have to declare an occupation when you register to be a candidate for all elected offices in Brazil. So we can actually look at this across different levels of government. So this is something that we're thinking, at least in the case of Brazil, we can see whether there's some effect on it. And again, it might be conditioned by the level of government. Some lower level elected offices might be less costly to get elected to than the national legislature. Certainly, presidential campaigns these days are extremely expensive. And finally, it could be that parties are reluctant to support working class candidates. And so one thing that we're trying to do now is to look at the differences across parties and see whether there's something about the nomination processes that actually does vary quite dramatically across the region that affects the proportion of working class candidates and maybe elected legislators who come from these different parties. And I sort of forgot to mention, but one of the things about these inequalities that I found striking is that the countries that have sort of traditional
in the back, which you're welcome to have. Also, there are copies of the Lunchtime lecture series events for the lectures, for the rest of the semester. If you want to take one of those. Also, we are trying to collect more data, information, feedback on our lecture series and other events. So we have our very fancy comment box over there. If you want to fill out a hard copy survey after this event, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, we have a link on our homepage. You can go right to lessons.wis.edu and click on the survey, and there's a little drop down. You can pick today's lecture, and it's not evaluating our speaker per se. So don't feel it's more about just the programming that we are putting together to find out if it's meeting the needs of our attendees. So one other quick thing I wanted to mention is that we have a sort of a last minute event that we wanted to notify all of you on that we are co-sponsoring, and it missed the noticias because there were issues, visa issues with the speaker. His name is Pedro Cayuqueo. He's a Mapuche journalist from Chile, and he is going to be giving a talk this Thursday at noon at Union South. I will leave this up there, and I'm also going to send an email out to our listserv. So if you're on the listserv, you'll get details. But the title is 40 Years After the Coup, Indigenous Rights, Democracy, and the Struggle for Recognition of the Mapuche People in Chile.
So this is part of a larger project co-authored with Nick Carnes at Duke. Most of his research is on the United States, and so I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between this project on Latin America and similar things that we see in the United States. This particular paper and set of evidence that I'll present is fairly far along, so I welcome comments and questions on that. But I'll sort of talk at the end about where we want to go with this project and sort of future papers that we're working on now, and I'd particularly love some feedback on all of that. So the question we want to ask in this project is, does class matter for representation? That's really our big question. And in political science in the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a kind of proliferation of the study of elites. Part of that effort focused on the class backgrounds of those elites. And people noticed that there was inequality in the descriptive representation of social class. As Matthews summarizes in 1985, almost everywhere legislators are better educated, possess higher status occupations, and have more privileged backgrounds than the people they represent. This is true basically in every democracy that people have looked at. It's certainly true in the United States, and as I'll show you, it's certainly true in Latin America.
That's all I've got to say. Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for coming to our lecture, our series here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Noam Lupu. For us, it's great to see how the faculty keeps on growing and reinvigorating in the program, so it's great to have you here. Noam is a professor here in the Department of Political Science. He got his PhD from Princeton University with an award-winning dissertation. His current book project is on party brands in crisis. So join me to welcome Noam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, especially on such a lovely day.